Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. Get ready for today's unnerving journey. I was always cautious about taking the last bus home, but that night, I didn't have a choice. My shift at the diner ran late, and by the time I made it to the bus stop on Camelback Road, the streets were deserted. The familiar green and yellow bus pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and I climbed aboard. Sliding into a seat near the middle, I set my bag on my lap and leaned against the window. The soft hum of the engine and the dim lighting lulled me into a heavy sleep. When I woke up, everything felt off. The city lights were gone, replaced by vast stretches of barren desert. The bus was on some unlit, winding road far from the familiar grid of Phoenix streets. My heart began to race. I glanced around. Only a handful of passengers were scattered across the seats now, men who seemed out of place for this late hour. They were dressed casually, but their stares felt heavy, almost predatory. Trying to stay calm, I approached the driver. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling. "I think you missed my stop. Where are we going?" The driver didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. "Sit down," he muttered, his voice flat. "Sir, this isn't the right route." "I said sit down," he barked, louder this time. Panic surged through me. I glanced back at the passengers. A man with a thick beard was watching me intently, whispering something to the person beside him. They both smirked. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled back to my seat. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, out here in the middle of nowhere, I was completely cut off. The men began to shift in their seats, exchanging knowing glances. One of them stood and started walking toward me. "You look lost," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "I'm fine," I snapped, clutching my bag tighter. "Don't be like that," he said, his grin widening. "We're all friends here." My heart pounded as I realized what was happening. This wasn't just a wrong turn, this was a setup. These men, the driver, all of them, they were in on it. I scanned the bus frantically, looking for anything that could help me. Then I saw it, the emergency alarm panel near the back door. The man took another step closer. I had seconds to act. Gripping my bag tightly, I bolted for the panel. He lunged at me, but I managed to hit the red button before he could grab me. The bus screeched to a halt, and a deafening alarm blared into the stillness of the night. The driver yelled something, and the men panicked, rushing toward the front to shut off the noise. As the bus sat motionless on the roadside, I noticed flashing red and blue lights approaching in the distance. A patrol car was heading straight for us. The officer pulled over and climbed aboard, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his sharp gaze taking in the scene. Before the men could come up with an excuse, I shouted, "They're kidnapping me!" The officer didn't hesitate. He ordered everyone off the bus, radioing for backup. The men tried to run, but were quickly subdued. Sitting on the side of the road, wrapped in a blanket provided by the officer, I watched as the suspects were handcuffed and loaded into patrol cars. The officer assured me I was safe now, but the fear lingered. That night, I learned just how thin the line between normal and nightmare could be, and I vowed never to let my guard down again. I was on my way to San Francisco for a job interview, a chance to finally turn things around. The Greyhound bus station in Los Angeles was chaotic, but I managed to grab a seat near the middle, clutching my ticket tightly. Everything seemed fine at first. The bus hummed along the coastal highway, and I let my mind wander as the golden California sun dipped into the horizon. But halfway into the trip, I noticed something strange. My ticket, which I had placed in the pocket of my jacket, wasn't mine anymore. The destination read Redding instead of San Francisco. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. Had someone switched it? But when? "Everything okay?" a voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned to see a man sitting across the aisle, his smile a little too wide, his gaze too curious. "Yeah, I'm fine," I muttered, folding the ticket and shoving it back into my pocket. "First time on this route?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I lied, trying not to engage. Something about him set me on edge. The woman sitting 2 rows ahead turned her head slightly, as if listening in. A man behind her smirked. Suddenly, I realized I was surrounded by overly friendly strangers, all watching me just a little too closely. The air felt thick with unease. Pretending to adjust my headphones, I leaned back and closed my eyes, listening to their murmured conversation. Next stop, he won't even notice, as long as the package stays hidden. Just keep him calm until we're clear. My stomach twisted. They were talking about me, or at least I was part of whatever plan they had. I glanced around, searching for an ally, but everyone else seemed oblivious or asleep. As the bus approached a dimly lit gas station, I made my move. I stood up, clutching my stomach. "Driver, can we stop? I'm gonna be sick." The driver sighed and pulled over, clearly annoyed. I stumbled off the bus, acting disoriented, and headed for the restroom. Once inside, I locked the door and scanned the room for an exit. A small window above the sink offered my only chance. It was a tight squeeze, but adrenaline worked wonders. I scrambled out, landing awkwardly on the gravel. Heart pounding, I darted toward the convenience store and begged the clerk to call the police. From behind the shelves, I watched the group emerge from the bus, clearly agitated. They didn't see me, and after a tense few minutes, the bus left without me. When the police arrived, I explained what I overheard. They didn't seem surprised. Turns out, a drug smuggling ring had been operating on Greyhound routes, using unsuspecting passengers as couriers by planting drugs in their luggage. I was lucky to escape, but the thought of what could have happened still haunts me. The job interview? I never made it, but I'm alive, and that's worth more than any opportunity. The subway was my lifeline, the quickest way to get from my job in Midtown to my tiny apartment in Brooklyn. Tonight was no different, though the car was quieter than usual. I stepped onto the train at 42nd Street, grateful for a mostly empty car. I settled into a seat near the door, scrolling through my phone. It was then I noticed him. A man sitting at the far end of the car, his reflection catching my eye in the window. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, staring. But not at me directly, at my reflection. I tried to shake it off. It was New York. Odd encounters were part of the package. But as the train rumbled south, the hairs on the back of my neck wouldn't settle. At 14th Street, I decided to test my gut. I switched trains, hopping onto a different line, heading toward Brooklyn. As the doors slid shut, I glanced behind me, half expecting to see nothing. But there he was. He had followed me. My heart raced. This was no coincidence. Trying not to panic, I kept my head down and my phone out, pretending to text. The next stop, I repeated the maneuver, dodging onto another train at the last second. Again, he followed, always choosing a seat at the back, his eyes fixed on my reflection. By the time I reached my stop, my nerves were shot. I stepped off and walked briskly toward the exit, hoping to lose him in the crowd. But when I glanced over my shoulder, He was there, matching my pace. I spun around, adrenaline surging. "What do you want?" I demanded. He stopped abruptly, startled by my outburst. Up close, I noticed how weathered he looked. Unkempt hair, a faded jacket, and eyes that seemed lost. "You," he began, his voice hoarse. "You're her." "What are you talking about?" I asked, keeping a safe distance. "My daughter," he said, almost pleading. "You look just like her." For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. Maybe he wasn't dangerous, just confused. "I think you have the wrong person," I said firmly, trying to step around him. He reached into his pocket, and my pulse spiked. Was he pulling out a weapon? I froze. But instead, he withdrew a crumpled photo. He held it out, and I hesitated before taking it. The girl in the picture did look like me. Same dark hair, same glasses, but younger. "She's gone," he murmured. "Left years ago. I thought maybe..." I handed the photo back. I'm sorry," I said, softening just a little. "But I'm not her." He nodded slowly, as if processing my words. But something in his expression unsettled me. His fixation wasn't normal, and the way he had followed me suggested deeper issues. I hurried home, locking the door behind me and double-checking the windows. That night, I filed a police report, detailing everything: the staring, the following, the photo. I didn't see him again after that, but sometimes, when I'm on the subway, I catch myself checking the windows for reflections, just in case. The gentle sway of the train and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks had lulled me into a light sleep. The cozy sleep of a cabin felt like a world of its own, insulated from the chaos outside. I was midway through a 2-day journey down the West Coast, enjoying the rare luxury of uninterrupted solitude. But my peace was shattered when I woke up to the faint sound of movement outside my door. My eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the corridor light seeping through the frosted glass window. I reached for the handle, intending to head out and stretch my legs, only to find the door wouldn't budge. Locked from the outside. I jiggled the handle harder, a knot forming in my stomach. This didn't make sense. Sleeper cabin doors locked from the inside, not the other way around. Then I heard it, a dragging sound, slow and deliberate. I pressed my face to the small window and peered into the corridor. A man in a gray hoodie was hunched over, dragging what looked like an unconscious passenger. The victim's limp body was partially obscured, but I caught a glimpse of a hand dangling lifelessly, and my breath hitched. My first instinct was to shout, but the man turned, glancing down the corridor. His face was shadowed, but his tense posture radiated menace. I backed away from the door, heart pounding. Think. I needed to think. I scanned the cabin for anything I could use to defend myself or escape. My phone had no signal. It hadn't since we'd left the last station hours ago. Then, my eyes landed on the fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the door. I grabbed it, hesitating only briefly before swinging it at the door latch with all my strength. The first hit dented the metal but didn't break it. The noise was loud, echoing through the small space, and I prayed it didn't attract attention. The second strike did the trick. The latch gave way, and the door creaked open. I peeked out cautiously, but the corridor was empty. The man and his victim were gone. I bolted toward the security office near the dining car, nearly colliding with the conductor. "Someone's in trouble," I blurted, explaining what I'd seen. Security responded immediately, locking down the train. They found the man a few cars away, rifling through passengers' belongings. His pockets were stuffed with wallets, jewelry, and phones. The unconscious passenger had been drugged with a spiked drink, but was breathing steadily. As the authorities escorted the thief off the train at the next stop, I couldn't shake the image of that limp body being dragged through the corridor. The rest of the journey passed in a haze of unease. Though the thief had been caught, the thought of how easily I could have been his next victim kept me wide awake, until we pulled into Los Angeles. I never booked another sleeper cabin after that. It was another long day and I was ready to head home. The MARTA bus was nearly empty, just a handful of tired commuters like me, spread out in the dimly lit cabin. I sank into my usual seat near the middle, plugging in my headphones and zoning out to the hum of the engine. We approached the first stop on the route, but the bus didn't slow down. I glanced up, confused. Maybe the driver didn't see anyone waiting. Then we skipped the next stop, and the next. The unease was palpable as murmurs spread among the passengers. A young woman near the front approached the driver's booth, tapping on the glass. He didn't respond. She knocked harder, her voice shaky. "Sir, are you okay?" "Nothing." That's when I noticed the bus wasn't taking its usual turns. We were heading deeper into the industrial outskirts of Atlanta, where warehouses and empty lots stretched endlessly. My pulse quickened. An older man sitting nearby tried to calm everyone down. Maybe he's just rerouting. They do that sometimes. But his voice wavered. He didn't believe his own words. I decided to take action. As I approached the driver's booth, I could see him slumped forward, his head tilted unnaturally against the wheel. His hands were limp, but his foot must have been stuck on the accelerator. "Hey!" I shouted, banging on the glass. "Are you okay?" Still no response. The bus jolted as it veered toward the edge of the road, nearly colliding with a guardrail. People screamed. I knew I had to act fast. "Everyone hold on!" I yelled, throwing open the door to the driver's booth. My hands trembled as I tried to pry his foot off the gas pedal. The bus swerved again, and I nearly lost my footing. Using all my strength, I yanked him back and slid into the driver's seat. The controls were overwhelming, a mess of buttons and levers, but I managed to pull the brake lever, bringing the bus to a screeching halt. The silence that followed was deafening. The passengers crowded around as I checked the driver's pulse. He was alive but barely conscious, his face pale and clammy. One of the passengers called 911, and within minutes, paramedics arrived. They said the driver had suffered a severe diabetic episode, rendering him semi-unconscious. If we hadn't stopped the bus, it could have ended in disaster. The paramedics assured me he would recover, but the thought of what could have happened stayed with me. As I finally stepped off the bus and into the cool Atlanta night, I realized how close we'd all come to tragedy. I never thought a simple commute could turn into a life-or-death situation, but that night, I learned to never take safety or vigilance for granted. I was already regretting my decision to book the cheapest flight possible. The airline shuttle service from Las Vegas to LAX was overbooked, and we were crammed into an old bus with a barely functioning air conditioner. The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly around us, a barren wasteland of dust and heat waves. About halfway through the trip, the bus sputtered and lurched to a stop. The driver stepped out, muttering something about engine trouble. A collective groan rippled through the passengers as we realized we were stuck in the middle of nowhere. Time dragged on. The oppressive heat and lack of cell service made everyone irritable. A young couple argued loudly over whether to start walking. An older man complained nonstop about the lack of communication from the driver. And then there was him. The man sat in the back, silent for most of the trip. Now, he stood up, his eyes scanning the restless crowd. He pulled a small knife from his pocket and waved it in the air, his voice calm but chilling. "We're not dying out here because of incompetence," he said. "If the driver can't fix this, we're taking matters into our own hands." Panic set in. People scrambled to the front of the bus, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the man. I stayed in my seat, trying to think. The situation was spiraling, and I knew someone had to act before things got worse. I stood up, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Hey, everyone, calm down. Nobody's going to solve anything like this." I turned to the man with the knife. "We need to work together, not turn on each other." He glared at me, the knife glinting in the harsh sunlight streaming through the windows. "And what do you suggest we do?" "Start with what we have," I said, pointing to the bags piled in the storage racks. "Food, water, anything useful. Let's pool resources and figure out a plan." Surprisingly, a few people stepped forward. One woman offered snacks from her carry-on. Another passenger had a flashlight and a small toolkit. Slowly, the tension eased as people began contributing. Even the man with the knife seemed less threatening, though he still kept it in hand. An hour later, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, we spotted headlights in the distance. I ran to the edge of the road, waving frantically. A trucker stopped, his face a mix of concern and curiosity as he stepped out of his rig. After a quick explanation, he radioed for help and offered to take a few passengers to the nearest town. The man with the knife quietly slipped back into his seat, no longer a threat. When the replacement bus finally arrived hours later, the group was weary but united in relief. I caught one last glimpse of the knife-wielding man as he exited, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before disappearing into the crowd. The journey continued without further incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that, for a moment, things could have gone very differently. Sometimes, survival depends not on strength, but on finding common ground in the face of chaos. I boarded the midnight train from Chicago, clutching my satchel tight. As a freelance journalist, overnight trips like this were part of the job. This time, I was covering a political rally in D.C., but the thought of catching a few hours of sleep before arriving was wishful thinking. The train car was quiet, the occasional murmur of hushed voices blending with the rhythmic clatter of wheels on the tracks. Settling into my seat, I caught snippets of a conversation behind me. Two men were speaking, their voices low but urgent. "Security at the station is tight, but it's not airtight. We can slip through. Timing has to be perfect. No mistakes this time." My curiosity piqued. I shifted in my seat, trying to hear more without drawing attention. They mentioned a name, a prominent senator scheduled to speak at the rally. My stomach churned as the implications sank in. Evident it's hard. My mouth opened wide and Phalanx's mouth pressed tightly against my mouth. I discreetly pulled out my phone to record them, but the dim light made it impossible to avoid detection. One of the men caught my glance in the window's reflection. "What's your problem?" he snapped, standing abruptly. The train's conductor, alerted by the commotion, approached. Before I could explain, the man accused me of eavesdropping and being disruptive. My protests were ignored, and the conductor escorted me to a separate car, warning me to keep to myself for the rest of the trip. Frustration bubbled over as I paced the confined space. I knew what I had heard. They were planning something dangerous, and time was running out. Then I remembered the small voice recorder I always carried, a backup for interviews. I hadn't pressed record on my phone, but this might still save me. I rewound the recorder, heart pounding as I played the muffled voices back. It was clear enough to hear the key parts of their conversation. Armed with the evidence, I flagged down the conductor and demanded he listen. Skeptical but curious, he obliged. His expression shifted as the recording played. "Stay here," he said, rushing off to notify security. The train was halted at the next station, where authorities boarded and apprehended the two men. Their belongings were searched, revealing detailed plans for an attack at Union Station. By the time we arrived in Washington, D.C., the senator and her team were safe, the threat neutralized. As I disembarked, the weight of what had just transpired hit me. I'd spent years chasing stories, but that night, the story found me. I'd always thought of journalism as a way to tell the truth, but for once, it felt like it had saved lives. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.